introduction. Before I get started, I would like to thank Chris for inviting me. It's actually the first time I'm presenting in Ireland. I just moved here about a year ago from Canada. So it's an honor to be part of this. It's a great event. Everything that was presented so far was just fantastic. Now the title has changed slightly, but it's still the same topic. At this point, I would like to mention I'm doing this research in collaboration with two colleagues in Utrecht University, Berland and Boschma. And I actually just came back from the Geography of Innovation conference that took place last week in Saint-Étienne. And we presented this research basically for the first time there. Hopefully you find it just as entertaining as they write it there. It's a very novel approach we're taking here to network analysis, basically. So quick outline, I will just talk about the goals, objectives, networks in general, and especially about knowledge spillovers and proximity measures. The case studies, Biotechnology, as you saw already from the title, our methodology, structure and control variables, results, and concluding remarks. So what was the initial motivation here? It was basically to analyze the geography of knowledge spillovers by investigating the way in which knowledge ties are organized. Now, the geography of innovation, or geography of knowledge spillovers, has a long tradition, about, 20 years anyways. Now, what we want to explain here is, but rather than just looking at geography per se, what are the driving forces that basically determine the structure of the network, and especially as it evolves from, let's say, from the beginning of a technology to some certain level of maturity. And of course, all of this was motivated by our lack of knowledge regarding all those issues. Now, let me just up front do a little bit of theoretical conceptualization of knowledge spillovers in an economic and geographic sense. Now, knowledge spillovers, I probably should mention this at this point, are externalities, findings from research that were undertaken by a firm or an individual that flow in as inputs into other firms or individuals that develop, again, new things. So they're basically references, citations to prior knowledge. And they're very important in an economic sense. First of all, they're valuable input factors in the knowledge creation process, needless to say. But they are the rationale for constant increasing marginal total factor productivity. It was Robert Solow back in the 50s who basically modeled economic growth. Capital labor was a given, and then we found out there's a residual. He called it total factor productivity. It basically was technology. He later got the Nobel Prize for this, and about 25 years later, Roma came along and developed endogenous growth theory. So rather than neoclassical growth theory, we found that, there's more than just capital and labor that goes in. And if you put the same amount of capital and labor into a factory, let's say, in two different countries, the outcome is not necessarily the same. So that's kind of the economic rationale. Now, in a geographic sense, we found, and especially it was there Chaffee and his colleagues, that knowledge spillovers are localized. They are bound in space. Well, this wasn't quite a surprise because knowledge in itself is concentrated in space. And this, of course, goes back to a long tradition of economists like Marshall and so on that already outlined that before. So, in short, knowledge networks are not randomly structured, they're highly skewed. We have stylized facts that knowledge is concentrated, that there's a barrier to knowledge spillovers, a spatial barrier. But the question here really is, is geography alone enough to explain the structure of knowledge spillovers? And so far, at least in economic geography, this was the case. We just explained it through geography mostly and slowly starting to bring in other proximity measures. And that's where probably the novelty of our study comes in. So in addition to geography we also take in consideration other proximity measures. First of all, cognitive proximity. So actors or individuals, they operate in a bound space of rationality. So they basically, everybody has a different knowledge base, okay? And this knowledge base determines search processes when we develop new products, processes, and so on. So what we have here, a sort of what was termed related variety, cognitive proximity, where we basically relate to things that we know ourselves more than more distant things. So that's where the proximity measure comes in. Second, we have organizational proximity, and here especially traded, untraded interdependencies. Traded, of course, if you locate it in a region, you have linkages, let's say to suppliers, maybe even customers, and so on. Untraded interdependencies, of course, are also important as firms are embedded in a spatial context. They take advantage of certain organizational types of forms, like maybe the legal system, how business is organized in general, unions, and so on come in, and this leads us to institutional proximity. So the boundaries are not quite there, sometimes blurred between those two especially. So the institutional framework, and as Douglas North framed it, government makes the rules of the game. And of course firms have to kind of adjust to that, right? And there's certain aspects, for example, intellectual property rights. Are they there? Are they not there? This of course leads to incentives to innovation or not to innovate. The Sotos put this back sometimes to the decline of South America, where intellectual property rights are not enforced as strict as in other places, and therefore there was little incentives for firms to innovate anymore, put basically research money out, as they didn't expect much in return. So institutional proximity is very important in this way too. And finally, social proximity. Economic knowledge relations are embedded in a social context, needless to say, face-to-face contact, and we're referring here especially to the properties of knowledge, codified knowledge that is written down, codified in some kind of documents and so on, or this more valuable knowledge, this tacit knowledge, and this came up today, where you basically derive knowledge when you talk to your colleagues, to your friends, that can't be explained. I always explain the difference to my students by how to ride a bike, right? I can explain to you how to ride a bike for hours and hours, but you really have to try it yourself, otherwise you won't really know how to do it. Okay, so let's return quickly back to knowledge spillovers. So there have been unintended circulation of knowledge between individuals and firms, and there was a classic dialogue. It was Paul Krugman, who of course a couple of years back got the Nobel Prize, who said, well, they can't be measured. There's no paper trail of knowledge spillovers. How do you do that? And then Jeffrey and Dreidenberg and Henderson, I mentioned that study before, came along in '93 and said, well, you can actually. There's something like patent citations. So each patent that gets developed has citations to prior patents. And through that paper trail, we can kind of trace how knowledge spills over from one company to another and over time and so on. So patent citations are the proxy for knowledge spillovers. Having said this, the next step in our study was, of course, to decide on an industry. We know that there's differences in terms of life cycles, how industries operate. Some are very knowledge intensive, others are not. And biotechnology represented itself as a great case study. First of all, the biotechnology sector has a high propensity to patent. So patenting is kind of a must, not a choice in biotechnology. We also knew kind of a starting point for at least the modern biotechnology sector, which was the development of the rDNA patent by Cohen and Hoyer. One was at Stanford, one was at the University of California, San Francisco. So that marked kind of the beginning of this industry. And then we had the US Supreme Court ruling that basically enabled especially rDNA methods to be patented. Of course, there was a lot of discussion when this technology first came out, genetically modified things and so on. It was quite scary at the time. It top is the list. So since the early 1990s, we have actually the modern biotechnology sector, and that's where our analysis starts. Just a few words to the data. We obtained US PTO patent data, so that's the United States Patent and Trademark Office data on biotechnology patents. You might wonder, well, if this is a kind of a global study, how can you do this with US patent? Well, the US is such a large market that every company patents. At least when you have something very much of value, you do get a patent in the United States. You don't want to miss out on a market with 360 million people. So basically German, Swiss, Italian, pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies all patent here. So we kind of have a global stock of knowledge there. Citations I already mentioned are the focus here. Just to give you a quick idea how this looks like, this is a patent document. What we have different kinds of information here. The inventors, it could be a single one or many. The assignee, which would be the company here. Then we have US patent classes. That's how technologies are classified. That's how we found out what's biotechnology patents we have. And then the reference cited. So those are a list of references to prior patents, maybe also literature and so on. So that's just how the data looks in its raw form. So, won't waste too much on the methodology, okay? I don't think it's very informative for you at this short period that I have here to explain, but nevertheless I want to mention it. So we identified all biotech organizations, so we do this on the firm level, not the inventor level. We covered about 57% of all inventions over the 30-year period. We just had to kind of eliminate the network dimension. So we took out, for example, companies that only had one patent, as they didn't really participate in the game of knowledge spillovers and so on. And then we created patent citation matrices, where we put basically all the companies in a matrix and then kind of looked who is citing whom. So that would be our dependent variable basically here. Now, I say we're doing this over a 30-year period, so we had to split this up. We did this in a subsequentially 3-year period, so that makes for 10 networks basically. And in each network, we basically run a dynamic social network analysis and then create a meta-analysis. Just to give you an idea of the numbers here, as you see, here's the number of organizations in the different networks. 2,800 in total. It of course goes up very extensively, kind of stabilizes around the 2,000 mark. Patents, about 83,000 in total. Again, it starts with 1,600 and then goes up to about 13,000 that stabilizes, and then of course inventors the same. Okay. What's so novel in our study? It's really this type of methodology. And what we do here is we apply a class of statistical network models based on the Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation procedures. They are known as stochastic actor-oriented models, and they are implemented in R. Many of you probably use R, and there the module is called Siena. There's actually very good textbooks. There's also studies already done utilizing this methodology, so if you're really interested, you can talk to me afterwards and I'll point you in the right direction. Now, the important thing is here that this class of models is the most promising, that eliminates the dynamics of social networks. Here's the formula, just I put it up, and basically the function in its most basic description describes the preferences, opportunities, and constraints of actors to cite patents developed by other actors. Like I said, that's the dependent, right? And then we throw in all our measures of proximity and so on, and we do it over the time periods. Just a quick word to structural variables. We've heard about those already a little bit. So there's different properties that networks have, and those are called the structural variables. They are usually utilizing those type of analysis. So we look at reciprocity, do actors cite each other, transitivity, basically are actors more connected if there's already two connections there, Cyclicity is more if the dry cycle is completed, if it's directed rather than we have different directions going on. And preferential attachment simply means if somebody is already popular, do other people or organizations in our case tag on to this more popular population of actors. Control variables, I mentioned that before. Of course, we measure them in different ways. Geographical proximity is just the inverse distance, basically, in kilometers. Cognitive proximity we measure by the number of different classes each organization covers. So the more classes overlap between organizations, the closer they are in their cognitive proximity. Social proximity, very important, the mobility of inventors. So if inventors move from company A to B, we would expect that they take knowledge with them. So we want to take that into account. Institutional and organizational proximities, there are different measures here, probably should go to the next slide. We measure size, experience, same country, if organizations basically are located both in the same country, they probably operate on the same institutional level and so on. So we put this all in. We also account for absorptive capacity. Basically, companies that patent a lot, that have a large workforce in the R&D department probably have a bigger absorptive capacity than a new biotech startup that only has 2 scientists and relies on the knowledge of those 2 individuals. Just a few words to the degree distribution. I said those type of networks, they are quite highly skewed. Of course, we see this here. On the left side, we have citations made. On the right side, citations received. We can kind of see that this is more hierarchically organized, right? So there's very few patents that are highly cited. And there's very few large companies, and we have a long tail here. So if successful patents are more highly skewed than the generation of patents on this side in general, we kind of have diminishing returns to innovation, right? So this in itself would be a finding. So doubling the output of patents doesn't necessarily double the output of successful patents. Just want to mention that. You probably are just quickly interested in what type of entities are involved in those networks. This is the first network, 81 to 83. We have mostly companies in there. There's only number 6 here on the list is the Research Corporation that refers to university patents. And number 7 is a French research institute, so could be accounted to public research. But other than that, we have mostly companies here, La Roche, Merck, Abbott, of course the big pharmaceutical players that were active in biotechnology already in the beginning of the 80s. Now, about 30 years later, the network looks very different, right? I mean, it's much denser, but what I want to point out here is that about half of the actors here, and those are the top 10 in terms of received citations, so in terms of how important they are universities. The University of California, which is up there, is the most central node. Okay, so university research apparently over the 30-year time span we are investigating the evolution here became much more important. Okay, everybody can read this, right? I give you 2 minutes. No, I won't do this. Okay, it's pretty simple. So I say we run a model for each time period, right? So we have basically 10 models, and then we compare over the time. Basically, what we're going to look in the next few slides quickly as time is running out. We compare how the individual variables change over time. Okay, so here it goes, density. Density is negative and it declines. So as we already saw with the degree distribution, there's very few possible connections. So the density over time, the network gets sparse and sparse in this way. Reciprocity, so if somebody cites, there's of course a higher frequency of citing back. So if you kind of know the research of one entity, this entity also knows the research that is done in your own organization. Transitivity goes down over time. It's very high at the beginning, but it's positive. So there is this kind of groups forming of 3 actors citing each other, but the next one, the 3 cycles, which would be the directed cycle, is not confirmed, it's actually negative. So it doesn't mean that A cites B, B cites C, and C cites A again. It's more like A and C cite B, so those kind of relationships. So that's usually what those type of network research studies find out with pattern citation networks. But like I say, we want to, of course, throw in the control variables that are usually not taken in consideration. Now, geography is positive over the whole time period, but it goes a little bit up and down. And now I just want to point out something important here. So we have studies that say geography proximity increases over time, and then we have the same studies that say decrease. Well, it depends on the time, right? Obviously, from here to here, it decreased. Here, it increased again, and then it decreases again. So in whatever point of time scientists decide to investigate a technology, they will perhaps find different things. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it depends on the time. Institutional proximity is not as significant and not important in the beginning, but becomes so later. Cognitive proximity goes down a lot over time. So it's very high up in terms of its coefficient in the beginning, and then declines sharply where it stabilizes down at almost 0. Okay, so that was one of the most interesting findings for us. We thought companies that are very similar cite each other much more, but not necessarily. This might have to do something with how a technology diffuses over time. It penetrates more and more different sectors in the industry. Labor mobility, like I said, very important. There's a problem with the data. Well, it's not really a problem with the data, but we have here a huge outlier that we relate back to a time of recession in the United States or in a global sense, where basically not many people moved because there was no opportunities to start up in different companies. Absorptive capacity goes down over time. So, just to bring this to an end, our aim was to analyze the driving forces of network structure over time, so in an evolutionary sense. And of course, it will take us now quite a while to interpret all those results, as you can see. But it's a fantastic first step to really investigate the evolution and kind of see the life cycle of a technology, not necessarily an industry. And of course, patent data is ideal here, as it captures a technology right when it's developed, whereas industry data comes in later. Biotechnology industry data wasn't there till the late 80s, because we had to have a certain amount of biotechnology companies to start actually collecting data on that. So thank you very much for your attention.